Hi and welcome to Capacity TV. I'm glad to be joined today by Shady from BICS. Shady, welcome.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to kickstart it with what are the challenges? What are the key challenges in the marketplace at the moment for content providers and network operators?
Content providers and network operators are facing new challenges from their enterprise customers. Those customers are using now more and more public IP in order to transport information between sites and get connected to the cloud. However, they are still expecting a fairly high level of quality and some guarantees which are very difficult to provide over public IP. So their operators need to find new ways of serving them. Next to that, there is an explosion on the traffic volumes that is driven by a lot of extra video content that is running around on the transport side. And also a different way of doing business with IoT and 5G coming around, generating new use cases that need to be supported properly. And finally, the advent of cloud, where in fact a lot of the processing is done in the cloud, and enterprises rely on that more and more. So having direct access to the cloud becomes also a very important concern. So in order to do that, to handle all of these new challenges, the operators and the content providers need to adapt their offering, and they also need to rely on their suppliers to provide the proper support for these challenges.
That's great. But you mentioned enterprises there and talking about IP connectivity. So how are we kind of ensuring that reliability for that kind of quality of that connectivity?
So basically, enterprises are looking for end-to-end quality guarantees and for guarantees on intent, which today is not foreseen in the public IP mode of operation. And therefore, the suppliers need to be able to organize around those requirements while keeping the price similar to what they offer on IP transit. Of course, the easy way would be to go back to dedicated channels, but the cost structure there is not what the enterprises are looking for. So in order to do that, you need to provide first the way to measure it and to report it to the customers in order to prove that the enterprise customer is getting what he's paying for. And next to that, you also need to be able to manage the traffic flows efficiently and to have that direct connectivity between the networks. So this is what needs to happen, and this is where the wholesale providers can help the operators by growing the peering connectivity, where the traffic flows are much more controlled, and also by doing in-network control.
Okay. You mentioned the explosion of traffic and the sort of data that's happening in the marketplace at the moment. Talking about content localization, I mean, how much of an important role is that sort of having within that sort of area of traffic explosion and surge?
There is a bit of a balance that is constantly happening between the explosion of the end user requirements in terms of traffic, and that explosion is not going to stop. It's just going on. However, if you think about the operators and the wholesale suppliers who have to transport that on their backbones, they mitigate that effect by having the caches and the CDNs. And the question is, how far does that mitigation compensate for the traffic explosion? And what we see is that in mature markets, the content providers are able to deploy those caches fairly easily, but there is a minimum volume requirement in order to justify the expense. And also, if you look at the cloud providers, they deploy their infrastructures in several locations, but those are very big investments, so they need to rely on a certain level of stability, both political and economical. And therefore, they're not able to do that deployment everywhere in the world. So to serve those countries where the volumes are not that high relatively to what's happening in Europe and in the US, or where political stability is still an issue, their backhaul providers will still have quite a lot of work to do, and there the volume growth is still very significant.
So looking specifically at the subsea market, you know, and the traffic flows with that, obviously we're seeing a lot more kind of hub activity, particularly with like Marseille and New York and places like that around the world. I mean, what's going on in that sense, in that specific kind of field of our industry?
Well, so if you take Marseille as an example, it's a perfect example of concentration and very fast growth over the last 5 years. And it's, of course, it's the hub effect that plays here at full scale. So the more cables are coming to Marseille, the more it's interesting for the next cable to be there, because it's so easy then to connect and to exchange traffic. But that model has some limitations, because at some point the hub becomes so big that you start to have a big risk in terms of diversity. So in order to mitigate this, there are two things that can be done. First, you can improve the connectivity to the hub. So, for example, Marseille has traditionally been connected on 2 or 3 routes, and this is becoming a bit too little. So adding routes to fan out of that location is one way of mitigating the issue. BICS has done that by connecting Marseille and Paris with a completely new route with a fairly low latency. It was live earlier this year. And another way of doing that is finding other entry points in the continent that allow to connect the major locations for internet exchange, like in Europe it's Frankfurt, London and Amsterdam, and allow them to connect them through an alternative entry point. And this is typically what is happening today with Italy, which is becoming a very significant entry point next to Marseille for traffic coming from the Middle East and from Asia. Again, there we have been very keen to not miss that boat, and we are able to provide connectivity back from Bari, where there's a major cable coming in, and from Sicily, where most of the cables are landing. And we do that with partners in Italy in order to connect them back to our network in the rest of Europe.
Excellent. Well, Shady, thank you so much for joining us today on Capacity TV. It's been great to hear about BICS and what kind of plans are happening at the moment.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.